I view it as magic, and you have light and you have dark, of course, but you have varying shades of gray and colors between those 2 points, and they all flow together.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the GlitchBottle podcast. I'm your host, Alexander Eth, and today we are opening the sarcophagus of traditional Egyptian magic with practitioner and creator of magical oils and incenses, Miss Laurie Romano. Now, Laurie has spent years studying and practicing traditional Egyptian magic, that is pre the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri for all you scholars out there. And Laurie's path to this specific kind of magic was the result of years of learning from other traditions, as well as a very intense consciousness-raising experience that Laurie shares about, which changed her life forever. In this podcast, Laurie also shares about the similarities and differences between Solomonic magic and traditional Egyptian magic. She also talks about how Egyptian magic is not Egyptian paganism, and she offers tips and resources for Solomonic magicians and anyone to get into the Egyptian branch of magical engagement. Laurie also shares about her online enterprise, Anubion Creations, which procures handcrafted magical oils, incenses, and powders, and so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Miss Laurie Romano. Laurie Romano, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on the GlitchBottle podcast today.
And thank you, Alexander. I'm very honored to be here. I am what I would say a very ordinary person who happens to be an occultist. I am married. I live in the Deep South in the United States. I'm a nurse by trade and education, although I'm not presently working in the healthcare field, and a person with many interests and hobbies. Probably the only thing that really sticks out in that brief description is the word occultist. I am like a lot of others in those demographics, but that's where the similarity ends. Being an occultist, though, is not a hobby or a vocation, at least not for me. It wasn't necessarily something that I decided to do one day because I felt bored or I wanted to change. It is something that has been with me since my earliest childhood memory of sitting under the table and playing with my invisible friends in one way or another. Whether that was watching my grandmother collect catnip from the woods behind her house, and she was knowledgeable about plants and she knew the woods, or watching my other grandmother tend plants in her backyard, or hearing stories from some of my other family about how they saw things happen before they did, or how they knew things that most people didn't know about others. Or later, working as a nurse when I was caring for the critically ill or injured, or witnessing the deaths of people. The unseen, the unacknowledged, and the unspoken have always been there for me. And in that mix, I experienced my own death, from which I returned at age 18. The things that I saw there and experienced would turn out to be life-changing in ways that I really didn't know about at the time, but would be a reference point for various times in my life as the years have gone by, and especially as I underwent various forms of magical and esoteric training. And one of the key life-changing events from that death experience was the first meeting with the Egyptian god Anubis that I can remember, although I'm pretty sure that he was around prior to that in other forms that I didn't necessarily identify as Anubis, and more about that later. If you ask me where it all started, it would kind of be difficult to pinpoint precisely, because I've always had awareness of the unseen worlds and awareness of spirits. As a child, it was like breathing. It was just there. I knew things about the worlds that I didn't have the ability to explain or the capacity to understand as a child. And later, as a nurse, I developed a sense of knowing about those I cared for, especially those that hovered between the worlds in the unconscious states and of the veil of death. Like other women in my family, I did see things before they happened. I knew things about people that you wouldn't necessarily know from ordinary ways. And I sensed the unseen a lot. In my early life, though, most of this type of stuff and these abilities were not seen as, quote, normal, and in a lot of circles, they still are not seen as normal. But therefore, I wasn't really in the habit of talking about that much. I grew up living in different worlds with my feet in different places, American culture, American family, and not too much out of the ordinary in a lot of ways, really, from at least with first glance. And as I went along, I would hear and feel the breath of the unseen, the unacknowledged secret energy that wove itself in and out of everything. As I went about my business, I was very conscious of that. And once in a while, things would happen that would tap into some deep, hidden, and old memories from somewhere. And these were memories that I had that weren't from the present incarnation. And I was very curious about these, but would usually remain quiet about it for various reasons. And there weren't a lot of people that talked about these things. It was pre-internet. Yeah, yes, I'm that old, and the environment that I lived in was rather conservative. And so I went along and did what I could do to live and grow up and go to college and start a career and the like, but I never ever forgot it. It was there. I wasn't always thinking about it, but I was aware of these different things that other people didn't talk about, and I knew. And it wasn't yet time to bring this into fruition. Again, I was busy developing life and getting a career and going to school. And in this time, I would read an occasional book that discussed or hinted at these things, and I felt stirring. When the internet started to come about, I found witches and magicians online, but I basically lurked and read mostly history and practices. Some of what I read wasn't so credible, but some of it was. And at first I didn't know anybody in person and didn't know of any organizations or groups, but I started to pick up a couple of practices and work with them, mostly going out in the backyard and doing ritual or doing some ritual on my living room floor with my dog watching. And that was kind of fun. Those were interesting times. An early interest of mine was Celtic history and magic, traditional witchcraft, and, of course, Wicca. Eventually, I did meet some people, joined up with them, and did what was called then a year and a day, and went through an initiation ceremony at the end to become a first degree. Shortly after that, I joined an initiatory order. We did ceremonial magic, spirit work, Arthurian and Grail tradition, Celtic, and this was where I got my first introduction to Egyptian magic. I left that organization after 4 years and several initiations, and a short while afterwards, I met a few members of the Golden Dawn, and within a few months, I had joined the Golden Dawn and received the first of many initiations there. And I am a member in good standing at present. And it was in this first initiatory order that Anubis began to make himself known to me in dreams. He began to show up in various forms in my sleeping life and as I was going about my business in my daily living. I'd be looking at the ceiling of my apartment, and for a second I would see him in conscient form on the round light fixture, surrounded by hieroglyphs. This was rather interesting. Another time I was out walking, one of my side jobs at the time was delivering newspapers. And I tossed a newspaper on the front step of a house that had a tall wooden privacy fence. And a dog started barking on the other side of that fence, sounding pretty big, quite fierce, and as if he was going to break that fence down and eat me for breakfast. And suddenly, I felt as if I was growing taller and taller and wider. My head began to feel as if my facial features were being pushed away, as if my nose and mouth were turning into a long snout, and ears growing out of my head. I felt a very strong energy flow through me, and my consciousness changed into something that I didn't recognize. And to this day, there are blank spaces in my memory of what actually happened in those minutes. But the big thing was that the dog stopped barking immediately, just like that, like someone pulled the plug on the dog. I didn't know what that was. This was something that I didn't have a name for, but that was one of the first interactions with Anubis, as I figured out later. And the dreams continued on, and with them came more lessons from Anubis. He helped me to set up an altar for him, begin to give him offerings, and talking with him regularly. Much of what he has actually shown and taught me, magically and otherwise, started here and has continued to the present day. And the memories of old that I talked about earlier, I began to see surface in dreams. And sometimes I would hear his voice in my head making connections with them. Sometimes I would see myself alive and dead in the ancient past. Other times I would be taken underground into tombs, into chambers. And still other times I would be in old dark temples, and he would be leading me through tunnels. He was always with me and still is, guiding and talking with and protecting and comforting me. I continued work with the first group that I mentioned earlier. I was doing the eclectic mix of practices that were influenced by myths of a couple of different traditions. And that's, some people might call it chaos magic, but it wasn't, at least not in my understanding of that. And also at this time, I gained experience working with some other beings, Raphael, the Celtic goddess, the Morrigan, and St. Jude. And I think I also worked with St. Anthony. I started really learning how to establish relationships and work with spirits and deities. But the one that really was the primary influence and remains a primary influence is Anubis. And then it came time for me to leave the first group that I was in for a variety of reasons, and this harkened in big changes for me. There were some hardships involved and some scary times and a lot of uncertainty, but some very wonderful things that I couldn't have imagined happening in the months following that. That was in 2014. I met people, including the man that I'd eventually marry, and many friends. And it was through them that my path with the Golden Dawn began. And I went deeper into folk magical practices that we talked about earlier. My relationship with Anubis also grew more complex, and many avenues opened to me as a result of that. And more intensive study of the ancient Egyptian religion and its interwoven magic. So deeper down the rabbit hole I went, and deeper down the rabbit hole I still go. I have learned a lot, but my biggest lessons were really only beginning.
So many listeners, Laurie, are very familiar with the traditional elements of, say, Solomonic magic. You know, things like a circle of protection, a phylactery, using a consecrated sword, planetary and astrological timing, calling the appropriate spirit, registers of spirits. We could go on and on. But for those listeners out there who might not be too familiar, Laurie, what are some of the key elements of traditional Egyptian magic? And I guess just to start this out, we're not talking about magic in the PGM, the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, right? We're talking about magic that is pre the PGM.
Yes, that is correct. And when I talk about traditional Egyptian magic, I am talking about pre-PGM, pre-Greek occupation. And the culture went back millennia, well before the Greeks entered into the picture, and the Romans and the PGM, if you will. I am familiar with the PGM, but most of my practice lies well before the PGM. Some basic characteristics of Egyptian magic are similar to the Solomonic paths, but one thing that one does need to know as they approach Egyptian magic is that approaching the religion is of greatest importance, because the religion and the magic and Egyptian philosophy and medicine and science were all woven together. I know that in Western culture and Western magic, it's traditionally separated. You have magic here, you have religion over there. The Egyptians didn't look at things that way. They actually did not have a word for religion. They had a word called Heka, and the pronunciation of that is not how they used to say it, but it is Heka. They wove it all together, and for them it wasn't cut into little pieces like it is, unfortunately, today. And magic to the ancient Egyptians was like breathing. They lived with it. They didn't see it as separate from the religion that they did. And they had inherent magic in the symbolism through the myths and through the gods, through their writing systems, the hieroglyphs and the hieratic. And many spells are based right in this. And an example that I can give is Sekhmet, the goddess Sekhmet and her 7 arrows. Sekhmet was considered the eye of Ra, one of the eyes of Ra, who is the creator god. If you wanted to either heal or curse someone, you could call upon Sekhmet with her 7 arrows, the 7 arrows of plagues. But she was also a healer, and her cult was known for having doctors and healers, and they were very, very good. And another characteristic is of the spoken word. Spoken words and words of power and precision with speech were imperative. And the priests and the magicians, which were usually one and the same, usually if you were one, you were the other, and the doctors with their incantations, spoken words and good speech were very important. Having someone's true name and naming their true nature through that name is imperative as well. And another thing is the ambiguities that are within the nature of the religion and the magic. Many of the different creation myths don't necessarily, some of them are different, and some of them have different conclusions, and some of them have different descriptions of the events of creation and the interactions with the gods. And that's something that I think folks in modern culture today find a little odd, and they can't reconcile the ambiguities. the ancient Egyptians had no problem with those ambiguities. And knowing the myths and knowing the gods were very, indispensable parts of working the magic. You couldn't do it, and you didn't have the consciousness if you did not know the myths and did not know the gods and what they did. And ancestor devotion, we call them the Aku. The ancient Egyptians believed that life did not end necessarily at the death of the physical body, and the ancestors lived on in the afterlife, and they believed that if you gave regular offerings and devotions and you spoke their name and you worked with them, that they were not dead. They continued to live on in the afterlife as the blessed dead. They would assist their family and those that were left behind, or in some cases, yes, they did haunt them. And that some magic and some Heka was used to send a restless dead back to where they came from. The assumption and the identification with the powers of the gods, or the gods themselves, is also an inherent part of the magic and the religion. And speaking things as if they were fact, that they were happening. And that might sound like a little thing. It's really pretty big, because that in a sense separates it from prayer. If you speak it, so shall it be. That's another thing that also separates Egyptian practice as I speak of it. You speak of it as if it is fact because it is already happening. The ancient Egyptians understood that the spoken word got the creative energies flowing, and things were already happening as you spoke it, as you called the true name, as you spoke the precise incantations and the precise speech.
Would that be, Laurie, similar to in Solomonic magic when you're using effectively divine god names to, at least in that case, constrain spirits? And they are Judeo-Christian, but they're also based on Greek names and kind of from that Alexandrian period. So where you say, like, by the power of Adonai Shaddai El Chai, I command you to. Is it more of a kind of invoking the names, commanding the spirits, or is it more of a supplication, petitioning Sekhmet and petitioning the gods, or how does that work?
Words of power and the power of the spoken word, and it's used in a combination of all of those ways. There is something that is said that creates, it's creating, it's asking, it's ordering, if you will. I don't want to say that, but there were spells and there are rituals where the gods are invoked, the names of power are invoked. You would say, by the power of Ra, or by the power of Atum, or Sekhmet, I ask that you do this and this. So there's a lot of similarities. And it's a bit of a combination of all of the above, depending on the spell or the ritual and depending on what you're doing.
In the Solomonic tradition, Laurie, as you know, the magician or the operator uses a consecrated circle and a phylactery, something that either has the sigil of the spirit that's being invoked or evoked, or holy names of God, things like that. In pre-PGM magic, was there any use of either a circle of protection or a phylactery, some kind of protection that the operator would use? And if so, what was it protecting the operator from?
There were very similar practices. They did use a circle. They used, circumambulation. They used amulets. They used divinations and oracles and a lot of the things that we know. But this depends on the formal practice that was done by the king or the pharaoh, and the formal temple practice that was done by the priests, and everyday magic. The first two were mainly to uphold the society. So the king or the pharaoh was seen as the link between the spirit world, the unseen, and the people. So his daily work did include a lot of these elements. The temple priests, their role was doing ritual magic to uphold the state, the state, the upper and the lower Egypt, that were united into one later. Their practices weren't necessarily focused that way, not the formal daily practices. They did have elements where they implored the gods to protect, and they did do circles, and they didn't have some of the elements that you speak of, but they did have rituals and practices. And when you talk about rituals and practices, realize that some of this could fall under liturgy, some of it could fall under magic, but most of the time it was combined neatly together. They did have practices. There's one that I'm thinking of along these lines. It was from the book of Overthrowing Apep, which was from the uncreated. It was a big evil monster that would attempt to overthrow the bark of the sun god Ra when he traveled the night bark in the 12 hours of the night, just as he rode the sun bark in the 12 hours of the day. And in that ritual, there are some times where they did do a circle. Usually what you would see in Egyptian ritual is you will see prayers. You would do prayers, you would do purifications, and sometimes you would have something like a circle, but you would also open up the shrine of the god. You would give an offering to the god, and then you would do you would light your incense, and you would do your purifications and work with the god in his shrine before you would do anything. They had a lot of different ritual forms, and they're from a lot of different sources, like the temples, the temple of Edfu. There was a lot of sources of ritual material from there. The pyramid texts also had a lot of information about different ritual forms, and some of those involved. There's one called the Cannibal Camp, which I find very fascinating. It is where the king eats the gods, and when you eat the god or you consume someone in that form, you gain their power. And back to the ritual of overthrowing Apophis, this also, or Apep, Apophis is the Greek form, I apologize. This also included the use of a wax figure, the use of 4 red pots that would get broken, and also calling upon the powers of the gods first, and assuming the identity of the god were other elements in ritual. So you called upon the protection. You did have the use of the circles. You had certain ritual implements that you used. Another ritual that was very important and widely used was the opening of the mouth ritual. That was done to vivify or bring the spirit of the gods into a statue, which was usually inside of a shrine, a little shrine that had doors on it, and you would have a ritual involved with that as well. And those gods would be clothed and worked with every day. Along those lines, I think very early Christians would say, no idolatry. They like to say that, the pagan religions were idolatry. And this is where I would like to point out that the ancient Egyptians saw their statues as alive, having the essence of the gods or the god in the statue. They were alive, and idolatry is just worshiping something that's inanimate. And therein lies the difference. Some would say, well, this is just, idolatry. It's really not, because the statues are alive. They have the life force drawn into them.
I think that's a very important distinction to point out, and that brings up another point, Laurie, which is in the kind of traditional Egyptian magical sphere, in order to practice the magic, did you have to be an Egyptian priest? Could you be, quote-unquote, a lay person? Who could practice this traditional Egyptian magic?
As I pointed out already, there were different practices. You had the formal practice that the pharaoh did, and you had the temple practice that the priests did, but you also had everyday magic and informal practice in the home. And they did have altars. They had statues. That was a lot more flexible. There weren't as many strict requirements for everyday magic. Many of these people did not have the access to, learning how to read, learning how to write the hieroglyphs. Those were mainly for scribes and people that were in the priesthood and the nobility, and those that were wealthy and those that were connected to the royal family. But for the everyday people, you had an altar in your home. You also had regular devotions to your ancestors. That was something that was very, very important. And you could sing, you could dance, you could play musical instruments. They really had a lot more flexibility and did a lot more different things, if you will. That's where the folk practices would come along. The practices differed depending on where you were in the society. Now, interestingly, and I want to get into this just a bit more, I mentioned earlier that knowing the myths and approaching the magic through the religion were very important. One thing that differentiates traditional Egyptian magic is they viewed things as being all interconnected. Everything was interconnected, and they had understandings of creation, and they viewed everything as connected and having an inherent divinity within it. They didn't separate things into magical and mundane like we do in Western culture. Life was magic, and they had a consciousness that we can learn a little bit about from the remaining artifacts and papyri and writings and different parts that we have found of their society. But their consciousness was very, very different from ours because of that, because of the viewpoint of everything being divine all the time. And it was a very singular consciousness. They were aware of themselves, as an individual person, but their culture was not individualism like our modern culture is, especially in America. Their consciousness was towards the community and creation and the created world. Everything was united. And the important thing that I'm getting at with this is the goddess Ma'at was both a goddess and a concept. And she was a concept of the created world and the universe. She was order and wisdom and truth and justice as well. It sounds a little weird to say that. Probably that's where traditional Egyptian magic can throw some folks off, because it does have its inherent ambiguities, and one might ask, well, how can someone be both a goddess and a concept? And that was something that didn't really trouble the ancient Egyptians. They accepted these nonlinear things. They just allowed it to all flow together. And Ma'at, she was cosmic. She was social, and she was the individual. All of the facets of society all had a role in upholding Ma'at. The pharaoh did, the king, through his rituals and his daily practices. He was the link between the world of the deities and the world of the society and the people. He was the link. The temple priests, they had their role in upholding Ma'at with the rituals that they did. That was not only to uphold Ma'at, but that was to uphold the state, meaning the two lands and the institutions that held the society together, and the people. Interesting thing about the ancient Egyptians is this consciousness and this awareness of the world, and this knowledge of Ma'at is something that was accessible to all people. This wasn't something that you went to school to learn, although there were people that were educated. The priests were, the scribes, people that learned some trades. The pharaoh, they were all educated, if you will. But this consciousness that I speak of and this understanding, this was something that was passed down through millennia, through cultural memories. And the origins of this, it is obviously classical Africa and African religion and African magic. Egypt is and was in the African continent, and that's something else that's important to take note of. And this was the consciousness in the way of viewing themselves and the world was very, very different from ours in this sense. People, whether they were educated or not, knew these things, and they were taught from an early age by their parents within their families, these things that I speak of, this awareness of the divine and the life cycles, life and birth and death, and the afterlife. And one thing that's interesting about this, on this note, is the Egyptians had a consciousness of living well and living in moderation, which is, again, that goes back to Ma'at and upholding Ma'at. They were able to live well and live a life of moderation and live in harmony with all beings in the created world, but they were also able to speak of their death. And the reason I bring this up is because we, in modern times, tend to want to deny death. We don't want to talk about death. The ancient Egyptians were able to live well with the awareness of their own death, and they saw death as something that was a part of the whole divine cycle of creation. So they figured if you live well and you live a life of harmony and in balance with everyone, and you treat people well and you take care of people and you are respected in your community, in your society, then more than likely you will be able to, once you cross the veil and once you die, you will be able to live with the blessed dead.
And I think this is as good a time as any to talk about the fact that Egyptian magic is not Egyptian paganism. And some listeners out there might think of traditional Egyptian magic and some of the things you've been describing as, oh, isn't that kind of like Egyptian paganism, like working with the gods? So, Laurie, I guess the question is, can you just kind of delineate the difference between Egyptian magic and how it is not Egyptian paganism?
I think it all depends on, your definition. But I would say traditional Egyptian magic, the way myself and other folks that do this, it is based in sources from ancient texts, from the papyrus, from temple inscriptions, and reading the hieroglyphs and studying history and studying these traditions directly from the ancient sources as much as we can. I think what would delineate paganism from that, and sometimes the line is quite thin. Traditional is adhering to the ancient sources, the primary sources that I just mentioned, as much as possible. I think paganism, if you will, tends to take bits and pieces. Sometimes what is used are some of the things, but I think it's much more eclectic.
The question then becomes, well, what are the methods that you're using to apply that kind of interaction that you want to have? Are they the traditional Egyptian methods, or are they methods that might weave in either New Age thinking or maybe other kind of elements of other cultures? I think that some people might be going down that road. So I really appreciate your kind of delineation with that.
Well, that's how I practice. And I know that there's times when people don't have access to anything different. And if their practice is more eclectic, I respect that. And most folks that practice the way that I do also respect that. And I think that the gods call who they call. And, my practices are a bit more formal. My traditional practices, I guess, are a bit more formal, and they involve elements of purification, and there's a given way that you start out in, like your daily practice, for example. There's a way that you start out. It involves giving offerings to my ancestors and the gods, and having a purpose. But it also involves prayer time as well. And before I go any farther, I would also like to talk about one of the other creation myths, which involves another god who is a concept as well. This figures a lot into my daily practice and how I try to conduct my life. And this is about the god Heka. And Heka is instrumental in the actual creation. There are three gods, actually, that are elements of Ra in this myth. They are elements, but they are also gods in and of themselves. And these gods are Hu, Sia, and Heka. Now, Sia, before anything is created by the god Ra, Sia, which is perception and intelligence, and Hu, which is utterance, authoritative utterance. And this thusly begins with Heka. These three gods work together, and in the texts, Heka is that force which creates from the word. It does specifically say with the word. And from Heka, beginning with Ra and the other two gods that I mentioned, Heka is also a concept. Heka is a god and Heka is a concept. And from that, with the breath and with the word, that is how I, when I do any kind of magical work, that is what I do my best to embody. and I don't want to say project because it's not a conscious projection. It is a flow. It's more like I bring forth from me. I create. And with these words, I start and I manifest. And this is important because with all magic, magic is about nature. It's about creation. It's the laws and the wisdom that are inherent within that creation. And we as magicians work with this. We create and we manifest in accordance with these forces. That's how I do magic. That's how I live. And along those lines, the ancient Egyptians, the traditional practices that I would say that I work with the most, they didn't see magic as something that you set aside time and do, if that makes any sense. Because they just saw magic and Heka as it was just something that was there. It was there. And magic wasn't as delineated. It wasn't really delineated for them too much at all. Of course, they did have magicians, they did have doctors, but it wasn't something that, they were so precise about, because magic and creating reached into their religious practices. It was a part of their religious practice, and that might be rather ambiguous sounding to people. I don't think it's so ambiguous sounding, because it's just it's a part of what I do. It's a part of every minute that I live. I mean, even breath, especially breath and spoken word, the creation and the utterance.
To that point, Laurie, I know in Western grimoire magic, it is very delineated where, there is before the ritual, during the ritual, and then after the ritual. And for instance, there's a 9-day purification process in, say, the Heptameron, for example, and there's abstaining, prayer, there's deep kind of meditation, clearing your mind of worldly things, and then going into the ritual to execute that, and then coming out of it, one doesn't necessarily have to follow all of the purification techniques. So it does seem like in Western grimoire magic, there is that delineation between pre and post ritual. But I think what you're saying is, in the traditional kind of pre-PGM world, magic, Heka, effectively infused everything, and almost everything was seen as a magical act. Would that be somewhat fair?
Yeah, and I mean, their consciousness was they didn't see it as a, quote, magical act. They didn't, it was just divine, and it was how things were, and it was all interconnected. Now, the practices of the king and the priest in the temples, now, they did have rather elaborate preparations. They did have to go through purification. And interestingly, we call it the 42 purifications. It has another name as the negative confessions, which I don't think is necessarily the best way to describe it. From chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, or the Book of Going Forth by Day, is probably more suitable for what the intention of the ancient Egyptians was. There were requirements for priests, and that involved washing, not eating certain things, celibacy, not taking things that were for the gods, not taking offerings, no fornication with someone else's spouse, no fornication with minor children, I should say. There were a lot of priestly requirements that were required. It was a little bit different in informal, everyday magic among the people, but the priestly requirements, even pre-ritual, were quite strict. You had to follow them scrupulously. And the ritual practices of the priests were maybe a little closer to what we would say as Solomonic, this is what you did, and then during and afterwards.
Laurie, when did astrological timing, in terms of like the traditional Chaldean order of the planets and the seven heavens of the seven spheres, when did that come into play? Was that part of the traditional Egyptian magical universe, or was that more post-traditional into the PGM and into the beginnings of Solomonic magic in terms of the 7 days of the week, 7 incenses for the 7 days of the week, spirits assigned to the 7 days? Can you talk about that from your knowledge?
Yeah, I can at least give a decent bare bones background of that. The Egyptians had a civil calendar, which is not the same as our calendar. I mean, there were seasons that were based on natural events. The calendar per se there was a couple of different ones that they had. The year starts at a different point than our modern calendars, or shall I say our Gregorian calendars. And another thing that the ancient Egyptians observed the stars and Orion and Sirius and the Great Bear. Those were very important things, and those tied into the calendar with different festivals. There was almost always something going on most days, according to most of the ancient calendars, the ancient Egyptian calendars. But the natural phenomenon and nature was observed, and that figures very, very much into the religion itself. And timing also figures into that. They timed things by natural events, and the gods also. The character of the gods and the activities of the gods were based on this as well. And that kind of formed, I guess, if you will, and it isn't, I'm simplifying this a bit, that did form the religion and the magic. That was the backbone, was the beginning observations of astrological data, of the inundation, which was the flooding from the Nile, that would happen, and that would in turn determine what happened the rest of the year. They didn't do the magical timing quite the same way, but the ways that we know today was based, at least in part, if not a lot, in those ancient understandings. They had a calendar, they had a zodiac, they observed nature, and they based the whole system in part from that.
So I'm going to give a really bad example, and then you're going to correct me since you're the expert. But let's say that, I wanted to contact Sekhmet, for example, and with the 7 arrows of plague, but also healing. And let's say that I wanted to contact Sekhmet because I had a family member who was ill. What would be the steps to do that? Would I check a resource of, okay, Sekhmet has this kind of offering that Sekhmet needs, and there's an hour in a day of Sekhmet, there's an appropriate time, or do I have to wait until a certain astrological time, and then when I do I invoke Sekhmet first? Do I invoke other gods? Like, how would this whole thing work?
If you don't already have a relationship with Sekhmet, then I would, before I approached her, I would do at least a bit of research. And I realize that doing research these days off the internet is kind of a double-edged sword, so I do say that tongue-in-cheek. Do some research and try to learn a bit about her before you approach her, and try to learn about her correspondences, what she likes. Contacting folks that work with her, that practice traditional magic. In this way, when you're attempting to, or you're thinking about doing a work with one of the Egyptian gods, then we don't necessarily differentiate it between the PGM, and the various papyruses. We tend to look at it from a mythological standpoint, and that's very important. Trying to learn about the god is a relatively modern thing because they didn't have the books that we have. They didn't have the books. They knew the myths, and they had a very different consciousness. So they would probably just approach her, but that's because they had the closeness to her. They would know the myths. And to sum up that, I would say for the modern practitioner, trying to do a little bit of research and talk to some folks that work with her is a good step. That will show that you respect her enough to try and learn about her if you're not familiar.
Are there any books or any resources or any kind of starter guides that you would recommend in terms of introducing people to the pantheon of Egyptian gods and kind of the set and setting for traditional Egyptian magic? Is there anything that you would recommend to get people started?
Yeah, actually, there are several. It's funny that you asked that because I was thinking before we started this, I was thinking, I need to have a list of resources and books. I'll just list a few. Geraldine Pinch, she's an Egyptologist, and she writes about both the creation myths and the gods. Yeah, she is a very good place to start if you're unfamiliar. She also writes a separate book that is strictly magic in ancient Egypt. Robert Rittner with the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. He writes a very good book that I would say is probably intermediate level because it does have a different approach and reads differently because it is from a research standpoint. His book is called The Mechanics of Ancient Egyptian Magical Practice, and he gets into a lot of the detail in there about, like, the meat and potatoes as far as practices go, about casting a circle, the breaking of pots, oracles, divination, and many of those things. I would recommend Thomas Allen's translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is also called the Book of Going Forth by Day. And I would also suggest the coffin texts. And there's a version of the coffin text that is written in different volumes. There's also a coffin text version by Raymond Faulkner that is all the volumes in one book, one great big huge thick book. And another book that I like is Jeremy Nadler wrote The Temple of the Cosmos, and that's a very, very good book. And that's more user-friendly, I guess, to the person that hasn't had a lot of experience with Egyptian magic or the Egyptian gods. I would recommend Bob Breyer, who writes a book on ancient Egyptian magic. There's a lot of stuff that you can buy and you can find.
To that point, Laurie, just about your own journey and traditional Egyptian magic, obviously you have a lot of experience with the Golden Dawn, as you mentioned at the beginning of the interview. And I'm curious, can you share with listeners what's the relationship, or is there a relationship between your traditional Egyptian magical practice and your Golden Dawn initiation and practice there? Is there any crossover? Is there any similarity between the two? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I can. As I said earlier, there's some stuff that I would prefer not to bring up, like the initiatory stuff, but I will say that they flow together and they very comfortably influence each other. Through my practice of the Golden Dawn, that kind of led me much, much deeper into working with the traditional Egyptian practices. Now, there's also, as I mentioned earlier, there's the Kemetic Orthodox Church that I'm involved with, and that also had a lot to do with my ability to get into the traditional practices much more deeply. You know, it isn't a matter of one practice and one set of practices versus the other. They very neatly and happily pollinate each other, if that makes any sense.
You have an entire site dedicated to this called Anubion Creations. Can you, Laurie, just share a little bit about what is Anubion Creations and how did this whole idea get started to have a center for people to check out and procure oils, incenses, and powders?
Well, as you might guess from the name, Anubion Creations, this is dedicated to the god Anubis. Everything that I do through Anubion is dedicated to Anubis. This is something that he led me into through, over time and through various manners. This is one of the ways that I serve the community. And it wasn't something that I really planned. It was something that grew organically. A couple years ago, at a rather imprecise time, I realized I started getting into making oils. There was the availability of condition oils and ritual oils online, and I bought a few of those, and I started working with some herbs, and I realized, you know what, this is going to get very, very expensive. So I started mixing them myself, getting the herbs and putting them into play with a couple essential oils. And I found them very powerful, and I also found it interesting to create. I loved creating it. I loved creating the oils and working with the plants and the various essential oils. And I found myself getting drawn into herbalism and learning a bit more about the natures of the herbs and some of the traditional formulas and how they worked together. And I started using my own stuff, and I really found it a very powerful experience. And every now and again, I would show other people what I was doing. It wasn't anything grand. It was just something that started with me sharing with people and talking with them about it. And it caught on. It really caught on. And one of my earliest proponents with this was Aaron Leach. I would share some of my oils with him, and he liked them, and lots of other people started liking them too. So it all kind of happened organically and very much from word of mouth with people. I only recently started any kind of formal advertising. Most of the requests that I get and the responses that I get are based on word of mouth, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful for people that gave me a chance and started using my oils and really liking my oils and encouraging me to do so. It did turn into a small business, and that small business is growing, and that makes me very happy. And it's also a way that I can make my contribution to the world. And it's a way that I can be an artist, if you will. And a lot of the formulas that I use are proprietary. I will occasionally share a drop of my method. So what I do, where I talked about the creation with the god Heka, that has a lot to do with how I birth my oils and how I do my incenses and my powders. And along those lines, magical timing as well does figure in with this, where if I'm making a planetary product, those are made in the waxing moon. That's one part of planetary timing that I do stick with. It's compounded and consecrated in the waxing moon, and I do sell planetary oils. I sell them through Doc Solomon's. I sell the planetary powders through there, and those I pretty well stick to traditional timing. Most of the rest of it, if I need to create something for a customer, I do try to time that well. And for the most part, the customer wants something for a specific purpose because they have a need for it. So while I do try and time that well, that kind of depends, because if the moon is waning and somebody wants something, I'm not going to make them wait until the moon is waxing again before I ship it, unless it's critical to the oil and to the purpose of what they're trying to do. Back to my process, I am specific with the individual product that I'm creating. It is, I name it, I create it, and I name it for the person, for the customer. I don't have a big inventory of things. I create and I birth the product for the customer with their name, with their intent, and with what they want. I don't, nothing goes out of my house without that specific work. I will pray over the oil or the incense or the powder. I will talk about the person and what they want. I will create it for that person. And the spoken word and the breath, I bring it to life. That's, I guess, I'm not going to say secret, but that is what I do. And that is how I am different. My process is similar, but the mythology and the magic that I draw upon is perhaps what sets me apart.
Absolutely. And just as a side note, I know we do have a question that Adam Pearson brought up in an online forum. I hope he doesn't mind me using his name. I definitely admire some of the Solomonic articles and work he's done. But Adam has a question for you where he's saying that he'd love to hear more about your own approaches to creating the products that you sell and your own unique takes on how magic works. And you've just done a great job kind of outlining your own process. And obviously you can only share some things, but when you are going through that process, Laurie, is it about achieving a kind of resonance where by the act of creating the product itself, you yourself as the creator of this oil or incense, you're kind of resonating with the energies, or you're resonating and also drawing them literally into the created product? Or just to Adam's question, how does that work, your whole creative process?
Well, my creative process, going way, way back, starts from just living. I live with these gods. I'm steeped in the religion and the magic, and my practices are set up so that I start off from that basis. It's very easy because of my daily practices and the way that I live. It's very easy to hone into that creative practice. And as I mentioned earlier, I do base it on a creation myth. And usually that involves authoritative word. I start off with prayers to the gods, and it's usually first to my patron gods and my parent gods and my beloved gods. I base it in that, and that I'm already honed into them, but that hones me in a little deeper to my purpose, and I ask them to help me create whatever it is that I'm creating for my customer, for their purposes. And then I breathe it, if you will, and literally and figuratively, into life. And I take each ingredient and I talk about that ingredient and I incorporate it all into a liturgy and a prayer.
Is it conscious for you at this point, or when you get an order for a planetary oil or something like that, do you just immediately kind of know exactly what you do and you get into this kind of flow every time now, or how does that work?
Absolutely. Now, depending on what kind of oil is ordered, I have, well, it's now 3. I just started my 3rd. I have notebooks and magical journals that have my formulas in there. And if this is something that, if I get an order for something that has a formula, I will, it's kind of like a cookbook. I will look that up. It isn't unusual that I will get a nudging once I, get myself sat down and I have all of my herbs and my oils and everything there. It isn't unusual that I will look at the formula and I'll get a nudging or be told, why don't you work with this, or why don't you, don't add that, or maybe you could substitute this for this. I get a lot of that, but it is the process that I use is very much a part of what I do. It's something that I don't necessarily mean to think about.
Laurie, this brings up the question of, as a female practitioner, Laurie, what is your sense about this? Is there enough of a female voice or a female perspective? And just how do you see this whole issue?
That's got quite a lot of tendrils to it. I think that I can see merit in a lot of what has been discussed online up to this point. My experience has been that I'm always very happy to see women out there and talking about it and writing good practice-based and research-based material. That's a great thing. And I'm not saying that gender doesn't matter, because it obviously does in our society. Although I think this is changing, our society is still very based on gender identity. And I think that this does and it doesn't influence magical practice. And I will say that I've seen a little bit of both in just in my own background. I have dealt with people that felt that women, and especially older women, really were not fit to be practicing. But in spite of that, I went ahead and I practiced anyway, because I don't let things like that hold me back at all. I just do it, and I don't care, whether I'm a woman or what my age is. I'm going to do it. I'm going to just do what I feel called to do. But I've also been involved with other groups that, admit men and women equally. And I know scores of female and male practitioners. So I think there are still people out there that look at women differently and relate to women as women and don't look at them as magical practitioners that have something to bring to the table and bring to the discussion. I tend to stay away from those people. I tend to like to hang out with folks that see us as a collective body. And I think there are probably more male practitioners out there that are writing, but I do know that there are women that write, and the numbers of women that are writing and contributing are catching up with that. So I do see that. And where I come from, women are respected as equals. I think that we bring certain things to the table because of our gender, but that's also relative as well. I'm from a viewpoint where we have aspects of both female and male in our natures, regardless of what our DNA and our chromosomes might say. I think I don't want to erase gender because I can hear the flogging wanting to start now. I do think that women perhaps tend to be a bit more reserved, especially when you're talking about the online world. And the online world is a small snapshot of what is out there. I think that there are a lot more people that are not necessarily talking about their experiences, and they're not writing about it because they either don't want to be involved, they don't want it out there, they see it as private. And I think that perhaps there are many more women out there than there are men. And I think that's changing. But here at this juncture, I would like to just interject something. As for me, I typically don't have a lot of it out there. I don't announce my affiliations. I don't have that on my Facebook page anywhere. And usually when I post something, I will post something that I feel can add something to a discussion. Other than that, I typically don't talk about my practice unless it's related to my business, or I post a lot of cat videos and animals and dogs, especially dogs, on my Facebook page. And I am on other social media. And I think it's important to say that as far as I'm concerned, there is to will, to know, to dare, and to be silent. And that isn't a law that governs my practice. That's a belief. And I believe that the less that is out there about the magic that you do, the better off it is and the more effective it is. And I do a lot of practices that I absolutely don't talk about. The majority of my practices is like that. So it's a little, as a pretty private person, I don't put it out there anyway, but not because I'm female. I don't put it out there because silence and not giving away your power and not making it ineffective. That's how I see it. That's how I see it.
Laurie, I think that is such a rejuvenating perspective because, especially after just being immersed in this menagerie of kind of the proper roles of people and gender, and is there enough of a voice? Of course, we need to fight, sexism and discrimination wherever we find it. But to echo something that you said, I find that male or female, when I'm in a deep discussion with someone about magical practice and really my primary interest on getting into the magical technique, what works, let's talk about the history, let's talk about the mystical aspects, all of that stuff, I find, just as you said, that gender doesn't matter, because even though it does, of course, inform our individual perceptions and day-to-day practice, those kind of discussions really allow us to go beyond that, where, and I think you'd agree with me, that eventually we can get to a world where people are just evaluated, and I think the magical community, for lack of a better word, strives to do this, is evaluate people on their own merits as opposed to any external identifiers. So, it doesn't matter if you're male or female or anything. It's, are you an effective magician for your clients? Do you delve into the research? Are you willing to, as you say, have those research-based materials out there for other people to talk about in a mature and intellectual way? I mean, that seems to me to be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I would I would say that. Now, I think there are folks that are out there and, they write books and, they sell products, they sell services. And I think that is okay for them to do. I mean, my own practice has definitely benefited from that. I think there's different things for everybody to do. And, my role, at least at this time, is, kind of semi-public. I will have people contact me and ask me questions, but I'm not really out there. I tend to approach magic. Obviously, I was born into this society with its warts and all, and the way that men and women are viewed. Of course, that influences mine. But I also put myself out there, and I am aware that when you set aside those trappings as much as possible, and you start talking with people about what is your magic and what practice do you do and what makes it work, what do you do, the differences. I don't think the focus is on the gender and the differentiation into, oh, you're a ceremonialist, oh, you do Solomonic, you do ATRs. I think when you make a compare and contrast, some of that differentiation and categorization does go away. And when we're talking about something as vast as the divine, there are a lot of paths to get there. We use different language. We use different tools. We use different, means to get there. But those are symbols. And when you get above the level of symbolism, it's all the one and the many, if you will.
Could you share some tips that you might have for people just setting out, just beginning their path, whether it's exploring traditional Egyptian magic or esotericism in general? Someone with your experience, can you maybe share two or three tips that you think the listeners could really use? Or, to phrase it in the negative, are there two or three pitfalls or two or three things that you think, hey, no matter what, you're doing spiritually or esoterically, do not do this?
The first one I would say is, don't believe everything that you hear. Be judicious in your resources and treat everything, have an open mind, but verify. Talk to people. Trust your instincts. If this person doesn't sound credible, or if they're trying to tell you something that you think is a tall tale, or they're making incredible claims, steer clear. Steer clear. Do your research. And do the best that you can to learn from credible resources. And I know that on the age of the internet, that's easier said than done, because we have so much information out there. And things are different from the way it used to be pre-internet. You either hooked up with a teacher and you learn from them mouth to ear, which in a lot of ways I think is still the best way to go about this. Or if you were lucky enough, you found a group and you learn through reading and through quiet time, research. I think with the internet, it's a little harder to differentiate, and it's a little harder to find good quality information, but it can be done. And I think what I just said about, doing the best that you can to see that it is credible, that your sources are credible. And if you decide to join a group, doing your research about that group before you join and asking questions is a good way to go. Now, if you are a solitary practitioner like I was, sometimes you will, you'll be approached by a god, as I was, through your dreams, in that instance, approach them with respect. Approach all gods and all paths and all beings with respect. If you get the nudging to set up an altar or set up a shrine, start doing that. Start working with it. The gods, at least in my practice, the gods are pretty forgiving. They want the relationship. In the beginning, when you don't know much and you don't know what to give them, or you don't know what color or whatever, either you're told or just, set up an altar somewhere. Start with, just a clean piece of linen, for example, a clean piece of white fabric, and set up a statue if you're able to find a statue, or even if you can't. Something as simple as perhaps a white candle and a glass of clear water and a stick of incense is a good way to start. I mentioned a couple of very helpful books earlier. There are a few good places on the web to get started with Egyptian traditional magic, but just reach out. I would say if there's something critical to all of the paths of magic is the relationships with the gods. My relationship with Anubis has taught me so much. I mean, I have obviously gained a lot through research and my affiliations with various groups, but having that relationship and working with the gods and setting up a simple altar to work with your ancestors, at least for me, those are probably the cornerstones around my practice. And having a daily practice of some sort, whether that involves a simple ritual that you do daily or as regularly as you can. There is, some people would say, well, I don't want to be, locked into a routine. You don't have to be locked into a routine. It's about doing something regularly. It's about communicating with the gods and praying and doing that work. It's about doing that on a regular basis, and not enough can be said about developing discipline and meditating, spending time in quiet contemplation. Do get a notebook, even just a cheapy spiral notebook, and write about your experiences. You can even get an audio or an MP3 recorder, and you can do it that way. You can do it on your computer, but talk about it and write about it. Don't just let it be lost to the sands of time. And these are private things. These are private things, not to be shared with the whole world unless you wish. Along the research lines, I think what's extremely, extremely important is to learn the history, learn about the culture, learn about who you are yourself as a person, learn about your family history and the culture that you grew up in and the ancient cultures where your practice comes from. Learn about those, honor those, and respect those. Learn about the history. I think the reason why I think that is so important is, at least where my practices are concerned, the history and the culture is African. It has many, many, many tendrils to it. It was an African civilization, and it's very important to, that's a form of also honoring the gods and honoring the ancestors and honoring the people that through oral tradition, and in the case of the ancient Egyptians, through their papyri, through their temple inscriptions, through the obelisks, through their tablets, they preserve this for us. And we owe it to any path that we practice to find out its roots And that isn't something that you just learn about in one day. Real history and history of cultures and traditions have a lot flowing into them. I can't emphasize that enough. That is extremely important. And it's also important to learn about various histories of religions and, the influences that they all had on each other. The Christian religion and the Gnostics, they had much earlier influences. The ancient Egyptian religion had an influence on them, on present-day society, something that the some Egyptologists tend to call Egyptomania, rather disrespectfully, but that's just my opinion. Ancient Egypt has and continues to have a profound influence on, our modern society, our modern magical practices. But know the roots of that. Know what the people were. Know the cultural practices, and know where things come from.
Is there anything else, Laurie, as we wrap up here that we haven't touched on that you just want to let listeners know about?
Yes, there are just a few things. I think we've covered most of this, but just a few things about the ancient Egyptian religion, which, as I have said a couple times, it's woven with the magic and with the medicine and with the philosophy. And it has its roots and its beginnings in African religion and African traditions and practices as well. And it wasn't, and it's still not, a religion of the book as a comparison to the monotheistic religions of Christianity and Islam, for example. It's not a religion of the book. I talked about the papyri and the temple inscriptions and the clay tablets that had things on them, that had the writing. It was not a religion of one book where there is one minister who gives a sermon. That wasn't how it was. That's something that's very, very different from Christianity. But I think that it's a very worthwhile thing to also learn the language, learn the ancient languages, and study an ancient language. And a lot of folks will say, well, what language? Latin, Greek, the classical languages, Middle Egyptian, learning how to read and write the hieroglyphs is a challenge that I'm starting to take up. And those in and of themselves are fascinating, because the hieroglyphs have ideas and they have sounds and magic flows through them. But learning the ancient classical languages of your path is very important as well. Another thing that did not happen necessarily in ancient Egyptian magic, we didn't have any of the stuff about high magic and low magic, light or dark magic, or other leftovers from Christian ideas, if you will. They saw magic as, I said earlier, Heka. It is an energy, and it was neutral. Now, what makes it different is the purpose that we choose. But they didn't, of course there were sorcerers and there were magicians, and there was invocation magic. There were workings with different gods, like the god Set. But Set in and of himself as a god didn't really start to be vilified until much later in Egyptian history. It was all very organic. They did have execration magic, but I didn't see a lot of categorization into this high magic and low magic thing. And that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. Because for me, I view it as magic. And you have light and you have dark, of course, but you have varying shades of gray and colors between those 2 points, and they all flowed together.
The element of magic itself and how it's a neutral force, that it really depends on what you're using the magic to. I mean, I know, to your point, Laurie, Dr. Stephen Skinner describes the magical techniques that he traces, and that's from the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri all the way up to the Byzantine Empire, and then into Rome, and then into Europe. All of the technology about the phylactery, the circles, the consecrated implements, that this is a technology, meaning that these are implements and these are tools, but in terms of how you use those tools depends on a lot of variables, and magic in and of itself is not good or evil. That's a context that was later applied to magic. Correct?
Indeed. Yeah, and definitely. I don't get hung up on those things because I think, high magic and low magic and light and dark and all of that, it is the difference. It's something that people attach to it. But at its basic level, it is energy and what you do with it. What you do with it through, your own practices is what you put on it. And there's something that I think is pretty important to note about traditional Egyptian magic, and then also later in the Greek and the Roman period, is that a lot of what we know about traditional Egyptian magic is based on funerary papyri that were found in tombs, and that was how the Book of the Dead, if you will, got its name. It is funerary because they did have elements that were written on these papyri that were used for making your way through the afterlife, becoming a transformed spirit and meeting the gods and going through various points in the afterlife, and your knowledge, according to the papyri, your knowledge at these various points and knowing the names of the various monsters and the various things that you will encounter there is very important. But a lot of the so-called funerary practices and funerary papyri, it wasn't just for the person that was dead. Of course, these practices were practiced at the tomb for the embalming and the mummification. But if you look at them in a different context, they were about initiations and they were elevating their consciousness. It's about doing work within an elevated state of consciousness. I want to very carefully say shamanic practices, but I don't refer to the shamanic practices of the Native Americans, for example, or of the African traditional religions. I'm strictly speaking and referring to the ancient Egyptian traditional practices. It has been said that the Egyptians were obsessed with death, and they were not obsessed with death. Some of the practices that are seen on the funeral papyri are very initiatory in nature. Some of the practices that we find elsewhere in some of the other books, the Book of the Gates, the Book of the Amduat, the Book of Going Forth by Day, in the coffin texts, they look, depending on the translation that you have, they are sometimes a little awkward to follow. But as you study it, and if you get to the point where you can know the hieroglyphs and translate from the hieroglyphs, you can see many different contexts in there. So I guess if I want to sum this up, I'd like to just say that it's not all about death and the afterlife. And the ancient Egyptians didn't see much of a difference in how you lived. As I mentioned much earlier, they believed in living well, and it is spoken in a translation of the Book of the Dead that I have. It is spoken that the purpose of life is to have something to offer death. And I think that refers to a life lived in moderation, in harmony, in truth, and justice, and order, and balance. The concept and the goddess of Ma'at. If you lived in Ma'at, then when the time did come for you to pass over, then you could live with the blessed dead. You could be one of the blessed dead and be amongst the gods. So it's not all about just the tombs and the temples and the mummies and things like that. I think if there's anything that I would like to conclude with, it is that you look at the culture and the traditions and the practices and the people, and look at their roots, look at the traditions that flowed into their roots. Evaluate ancient Egypt on its own merits. Try not to allow your own influences to look at these and say, well, that doesn't make any sense because those two creation myths are different. So what's true and what's false? Someone that I know fairly well said that they're all true and they're all false equally, except the ambiguity of things, and study and find their roots and have respect for those that did what they did to make the tradition available to you.
Dancing in the paradox, indeed.
Creation is linear in some ways, but it's non-linear in other ways. It's eternal change and eternal sameness. It's cyclical. It's random. It's not random. So yes, embrace the ambiguity.
Laurie Romano is a traditional Egyptian magical practitioner and owner of Anubion Creations. Laurie, cannot thank you enough for taking the time and joining us on the GlitchBottle podcast today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexander. It's been an honor and still somewhat of a surprise, I guess, if you will. But I enjoyed it, and I thank you. This is absolutely wonderful, and I hope that we can do it again at some point.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the GlitchBottle podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical GlitchBottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and subscribe and download free episodes anytime on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and on Spreaker.com. Just search GlitchBottle and enjoy. Also, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at GlitchBottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.